Welcome to Data in Biotech, a podcast from Cordi where we explore how companies leverage data to drive innovation in life sciences. Every 2 weeks, we sit down with an expert from the world of biotechnology to understand how they are using data science to solve technical challenges, streamline operations, and further innovation in their business. This week, we're excited to be joined by Annemie Ribbens, VP of Science, Evidence and Trials at icometrix, a company that offers a portfolio of AI solutions to assist healthcare with various challenges in neurological disorders, such as brain trauma, epilepsy, strokes, dementia, and Alzheimer's disease. During the interview, Ross and Annemie discussed the mission of icometrix in analyzing and treating neurological disorders, the application of machine learning enhancements in their tools to better understand the data that's being collected from patients and clinicians, what challenges exist in developing the data infrastructure necessary for the compliant transfer of patient data across the platform, and how machine learning will influence the application of precision medicine in biotech over the next 5 years. Here we go.
Annemie Ribbens, welcome to the Data in Biotech podcast.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So just to get us started, could you give us a brief introduction to your background and what led you here?
I hold a master's degrees in applied mathematics from the University of Leuven in Belgium. Afterwards, I started a PhD in the engineering department with a focus on brain MRI analysis. Actually, I combined mathematical models for then disease subtyping based on these brain MRI models to actually get a different kind of subtyping as compared to the clinical subtyping to have like a better understanding. After this more fundamental PhD, I went to University College London, and there I worked more on the translation towards bringing this kind of techniques towards clinical practice. And that's also how I got involved with icometrix, which is a company that brings automatic brain MRI quantification towards clinical routine. I started here as a researcher, systematically became responsible for all our research collaborations as well as for pharmaceutical collaborations. And as such, I first worked as a clinical project and program manager and then became the VP of clinical trials. Now we actually have a full visualized imaging CRO or life-size units, depending on how you want to call it. And I'm responsible for that. And my full role is now VP Clinical Trials, Science and Evidence. And beyond the pharmaceutical collaborations, I'm also responsible for running the evidence studies for all medical devices, working towards reimbursement, as well as working towards a better adoption by physicians of our technologies.
Interesting. So before we get to icometrix, could you just tell us a little bit about, why you do what you do? What motivated you to get in this field?
Yeah, sure. As you can hear, I'm a data scientist at heart, still really a mathematician at one hand, but always with a core interest in healthcare and in the medical field and in neurology in particular, and actually also very much into the pharmaceutical sector. And so what drives me is really this combination of these AI aspects and these data insights and how those can be used to actually improve drug development, improve care pathways, and as such, bringing the right treatment to the right patient at the right time and really improving patient outcomes. So it's like the core of it all, I think.
So with that in mind, talk to us about icometrix. What's the mission of the company and how does it accomplish that mission?
Yeah, sure. As you will hear, the mission is quite closely related with my personal ambitions, which is really nice. So the mission of icometrix is to significantly improve the daily lives of people with brain disorders through AI-driven precision medicine. So that's quite a big statement. So how does it work in practice? We have a set of AI tools that we developed with a specific focus on brain MRI images, where we help to basically quantify subtle changes in the brain that you could visually not directly assess. And as such, you're capable of detecting actually earlier disease progression or detecting earlier side effects of a treatment, and as such, assess drug safety, for instance. And this allows them to bring the patients faster to the right treatments at the right timing.
Interesting. So, there are a variety of MR tools out there for radiologists and biotech companies. Can you talk to me a little bit about, the icometrix portfolio and what sort of differentiates it from the other tools that are out there?
Yeah, sure. Perhaps I indeed start first with explaining a little bit what the icometrix portfolio is before diving into depth. Icometrix has developed an AI-driven care management platform, and it basically consists of two tools. One tool is our quantitative brain MRI image assessment, which is called icobrain. And the other one is iCompanion, which is a patient app that actually monitors what's happening between two neurological visits. All this information is then brought together in one care management platform. And this care management platform is then made available for healthcare practitioners where they have a lot more information, quantitative information, and more subtle information about disease progression. As such, they can make a better treatment decision. We have this information available for multiple sclerosis, but also for dementia, Alzheimer's disease, traumatic brain injury, epilepsy, and stroke. What differentiates us then from other companies that offer these kind of aspects for radiologists and biotech companies? That's first of all, as you already hear a little bit in what I was telling about, is that our goal is to, in the first place, bring the solutions towards clinical practice. And that means that there is a need for regulatory clearance. So our solutions are CE marked according to MDR and FDA cleared. Furthermore, for icobrain solution, we also worked a lot towards reimbursement. So we actually applied for CPT code last year that was issued beginning of this year by the American Medical Association, and it's now officially active. So actually there is a reimbursement now according to CMS for icobrain solutions, which is of course a big step forward in using these tools in daily clinical routine. Second aspect is more at the technological level, where of course, if you try to bring these kind of solutions towards clinical practice, they have to work for an individual patient. So you really have to look at individual level, what is changing, and the measurement error of your tools has as such to be very small. So there's a lot more validation, a lot more technical aspects to it to bring it to that level. Also, you need to integrate it properly in clinical routine. So it's focusing on PACS, EMR integration, and so on. All these aspects, of course, help them with our work towards biotech industry as well. So using these regulatory cleared aspects could translate things from drug development phases towards clinical routine. But again, also we could really look at individual cases, who is a responder, who is a non-responder, and whatnot. A final small thing that I wanted to mention, I've been talking already way too much, but that in the field of Alzheimer's disease, we know that there are now amyloid targeting drugs that have a very specific side effect that is quite unique to the drug, which is called ARIA, and it's visible on the brain MRI scans. And icometrix is actually the only company in the world that has now developed a software solution to automatically detect this ARIA side effects on the brain MRI scan. So that also really differentiates us from other companies, of course.
Interesting. So I think what would help sort of ground us in the conversations about data science as it's applied to this problem, and then also how these tools are used in a clinical setting, is if we just understand it from the patient perspective. You know, if I have a neurological disorder and I'm already seeing a physician, a specialist who's helping me with that kind of neurological disorder, how do I encounter sort of the icometrix ecosystem? And then how are you gathering data about a disorder? And then how are you helping the physician or helping in a clinical setting to, you know, improve the treatment or the understanding of that disorder?
Yeah, very good questions. So we work most of the time directly with providers. So that means that we go to clinical sites in the first place. Of course, our patient app is publicly available. For instance, every patient worldwide can just access the app and start using it. But the connection with the healthcare provider is made by the healthcare provider. And also the icobrain solutions, which work, of course, on the brain MRI scans, are made towards the imaging center where you're going to, or if it's included, like, for instance, in through this academic center. As mentioned, we go into the healthcare provider, and there we do then, once a patient comes in, he has like this information that is filled out over the year in the patient app. And that becomes visual in the portal. So that they can, for instance, already see, like, patient indicates like that he has a lot of problems on the cognitive aspects of their disease. On the other hand, they then get a brain MRI scan. On the brain MRI scan, they see, for instance, that there might be some atrophy in certain regions. We do a perfect quantification of these assessments, like, okay, there's so much brain volume loss, for instance, in the hippocampus. And this combination of information helps them to make like better decision making. This is, for instance, an example in multiple sclerosis. Other examples are in Alzheimer's disease, again, where atrophy patterns and cognition play a crucial role. But we also have, for instance, examples where the brain structural patterns can help with a better differential diagnosis, doing Alzheimer for frontal temporal dementia. So all this information is made available for the healthcare practitioner, and We have quite some very nice case studies from our healthcare providers that say, like, see, if we would not have had this information, then we thought that the patient was stable, while in fact the patient is not stable. Or I actually originally thought it was an Alzheimer patient, and it seems to be a frontotemporal dementia patient. So that it really actually improves diagnosis and monitoring of patients.
So inside the tool itself that the provider is interacting with, there are these sorts of AI ML driven quantitative assessments that are happening that are sort of giving them insight into the image that they would not otherwise have? Or is there something in the images themselves or in the data that's collected that is somehow richer or more insightful than it would otherwise be if they were using another tool?
It's a bit of both. I think in the first place, definitely of what we're providing for daily clinical routine is just something that it's very difficult to visually assess. For instance, the brain is a 3D shape. If it shrinks 1%, which is already actually a lot, it's actually to visually see that it has shrunken 1% is actually very, very hard to visually see that, let alone quantify that. And if you compare, for instance, an MS patient and versus a normal healthy person loses 0.2% per year, more or less. An MS patient loses 0.7% of their brain per year, more or less. So you see, making a differentiation between both would become very hard. Second aspect is, for instance, in multiple sclerosis, there are lesions, and you can visually see those lesions. But the radiologist has limited amount of time. So it's to scroll quickly through the brain MRI scans and see, and sometimes there are over 100 lesions present in the brain MRI scan. So then to quickly see whether there's one or two new lesions, that's actually quite hard, while actually those lesions can have quite a big impact. On the other hand, we also have technologies that analyze more the microstructure of the brain and things like that. And this is just visual, not visual at all. Therefore, you really need techniques and AI software to quantify those.
That's really interesting because it sounds like, some of the features that you're trying to pick up on that are happening inside of the brain are built, or all of them that you mentioned are built on an understanding of the nature of the diseases that you're trying to detect and sort of the symptoms that you would expect to see, and also where the human eye or our ability to like drink in all of the information that's there would fall short. So, the examples you gave, there's like a volumetric assessment of the brain and then a comparison to the previous time the patient was in, or, a counting of the number of lesions relative to the previous time. So the algorithms it's not just classifying as diagnosing a particular disease. It's really giving sort of the insights that the provider needs to understand better the progression of the disease. Am I thinking about that right?
Yeah, that's correct. They can indeed, based on this information, better monitor whether there's disease activity, yes or no. And that can be very subtle. Well, clinically, nothing is visual or nothing's happening. In the brain, changes might happen. And though it might actually indicate early progression, where due to this additional information, healthcare practitioners can act upon that. And same for drug development, actually. If you know very early on that actually something is changing, it can change your drug development process as well.
So I have a lot of follow-up questions on this, but before I get too far, the public patient-facing app, how does that play into the data that feeds the entire ecosystem that the provider is using to understand the disease? Is it really patient-reported outcomes, or is there some way that you're sort of able to measure things about the neurological disorder directly from somebody's phone that you wouldn't otherwise get to see?
Yeah, it's definitely a combination of those. So our patient app, first important thing is it's built from the patient out. So we have a quite good adherence. Everybody's already a little bit sick of apps, I think, nowadays. But because it is built a little bit from the patient out, like what they wanted to share also with their physician, we have a quite good adherence. So that's definitely the first part. There's also a big educational part for improving health literacy with patients and so on. But of course, we also look like what the healthcare practitioner actually needs to make decisions. Due to that, there are indeed patient-reported outcome questionnaires in the app. But there's also some forms of passive monitoring in there. For instance, we link it to step counts, which is quite an important marker in multiple sclerosis. We also have sleep patterns that we take into account. And we have some active tests as well concerning cognition to really have like an objective assessment of cognition rather than only the more subjective questionnaires.
Interesting. So, you're sort of going beyond the patient reported outcomes and getting into sort of the real world data ecosystem as well, sort of, directly monitoring what's happening with the patient and, feeding that information back to the provider. Very interesting. So given that you're sort of moving with the field in terms of what types of diagnostic tools are needed in order to give the provider better information about the progression of disease, how do you decide what types of machine learning enhancements to build on the data that you're already capturing on the provider and on the patient side?
Oh, there are two answers to this question. One is a technological question. So which AI models we're using? I must say, when we started the company, they were really like image driven and like intensity modeling combining with prior information and so on. But once the deep learning models and the training of these deep learning models became more established, I think also our company moved completely towards using convolutional neural networks to build our algorithms. So that's on the technical aspect. There's of course a clinical aspect to it as well. Like, which direction are you moving? Like, do you do segmentations of just your brain MRIs, or are you going to predictions and so as well? And looking at how the field is moving as well. What is relevant in a point in time? I think, for instance, in multiple sclerosis, we know that a lot of treatment decisions are made based on lesion load. So lesion load was of course the first aspect to trigger. But then more and more evidence became about silent progression in MS. So then we, of course, started developing algorithms for silent progression. Same in Alzheimer's disease. For a long time, there was actually no treatment. So what's the benefit of better monitoring if you cannot take any action upon that? Well, nowadays, treatments are coming to the market, but these treatments have then again safety effects. So first aspect is, of course, how can we measure the safety effects faster? Second aspect is there's a whole aspect of treating patients early. So we also have to look towards biomarkers and prediction models of how do we find these patients in the early stages. And so our development now is, of course, going in that direction as well, to find actually an optimal combination of biomarkers to find patients as early as possible in their disease course.
Very interesting. And you mentioned convolutional neural networks and this idea that you were originally sort of treating it as like a image classification problem, or sort of an object detection problem, or a semantic segmentation problem. But it also seems like there's kind of a time series aspect to what you're doing too, where you're trying to understand how these images compare to each other over time. So I'm curious if you have any insights you can share on sort of how that time series component comes into the way that you're giving information back to providers. Is it, built directly into the models themselves, or are you sort of like comparing model outputs in points in time to, help understand that?
No, you actually, it's very nice that you notice it. It's you're actually coming to one of the key differentiators of icometrix. Icometrix is one of the first companies that indeed handled information together. So if two follow-up scans of the same patients, if you handle these two scans separately, your measurement errors will be a lot higher. And so if you handle one image and then subsequently the other image and just compare outcomes, there can be a lot of bias introduced, for instance, due to different image contrast and so on. Well, if you're handling both scans at the same time and really assess like, okay, what's the difference between both scans and try to model what the difference is, you find a lot more subtleties and your measurement error becomes a lot smaller. And that's exactly where icometrix focused on. So that's actually one of our key strengths in our products.
Are you a biotechnology company looking to unlock the potential of your business data? Cordine can help. We're an enterprise data specialist that helps companies working in life sciences make smarter strategic decisions. From developing the right data strategy that starts with our data maturity assessment to building and delivering bespoke technical solutions, we are equipped to tackle the most complex data challenges. We have partnered with dozens of high-growth organizations, from manufacturers of custom oligonucleotides to molecular diagnostic companies, to achieve data competency. Whether you need to supplement existing technology teams with specialist expertise or launch a data program that lays the groundwork for future internal hires, you can partner with Cordine to unlock the potential of your business data today. Simply visit connect.cordine.com/biotech to learn more. Now, back to the show.
Interesting. So are you doing kind of pairwise comparisons of the images, or are you, as new images are coming in, are you incorporating them into the model in some way?
It depends a little bit, and I must say that depends on the application. So there's definitely a lot of pairwise. Well, in theory, we would love to handle all images together. The reason of pairwise comparison is often to do with what the clinical workflow is, and depending like when scans are coming in, also our follow-up scans acquired on the same scanner, different scanners, and so on. So that's why most of the time we stick to pairwise comparisons. If we go, for instance, to trials and so on, where there's more standardization, then we can combine more scans over time, and then actually have indeed more this time series approach.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, the flexibility of these deep learning models is, both a great strength and a great weakness, because the potential architectures that you could explore for a problem like this, where you have sort of, a sequence of images and then something that you're trying to detect, you could spend years exploring that kind of path. But also, you see this opportunity in kind of pairwise comparison, and it's logical, and it also, fits with sort of the way that the provider thinks about the problem. And so, surfacing the insights that you get then back to the provider is so much easier. So, you have to think of how you operationalize the model as well. Am I thinking about that right?
Yeah, exactly. What we do, of course, is in the end for the provider, bundle all information together. There are providers where we have received scans from the last 10 years, and they're actually doing a very good job on scanning their patients on the same scanner. And they're capable on really providing what the trends are. And that's really nice to see them, because then you can really see okay, this is how the lesions evolved over time, or this is where how the brain volume evolved over time. And then if you see all of a sudden a strong drop or a strong increase in lesion load, for instance, then you know that something is going on, and you have even more information to make better treatment decisions on.
Right. So you've got this portfolio of tools, and then you've always also got this portfolio of sort of analytical methods and machine learning models that you apply to the data that comes out of those tools. So I think, I want to shift a little bit into how you partner with biotech and pharma companies to use both the tools and the data and the skills to help their use case. So could you give us a little bit of insight into, how those partnerships tend to work?
Yeah, sure. It's quite extensive as well, actually. So as you hear, we're coming on one hand from the real world setting. So of course, pharma has also always looked at that. Okay, icometrix is well connected, actually. It's been integrated with a lot of hospitals, insights from clinical practice. So in that sense, they're really looking to us to get real world evidence. First of all, very logically, doing real world evidence studies, phase 4 studies to post-market surveillance of their drugs and so on in clinical practice. But also okay, how can icometrix actually, if these digital tools are in the market and they actually helping to putting patients on the right treatment and actually putting attention on certain biomarkers that might be linked to certain mechanisms of action, how can we leverage these tools together and basically explore how clinical decision-making is done in clinical practice, and as such, better strategize how they put their drug in the market. And as such, we can help with market access strategies of pharmaceutical companies as well. Another aspect is on, of course, again, from the real world setting, that again, we have a very large network of integrated hospitals and sites that, of course, help also with a kind of data collection platform. And of course, that's all depending on data agreements and so on as well. But in that context, we also have largely worked together with pharmaceutical companies already towards registries, integrating with registries, and so on. And then the final very classical aspect of our collaborations with pharmaceutical industry also stays there. So we also a little bit like a specialist imaging CRO. So we helping during the drug development phases, phase 2, phase 3 studies, where actually the icometrix measurements are used as trial endpoints. So instead of having a radiological reader that manually annotates everything, automated software is used. It can be in combination, so in supervision with the radiologist. But using the software first helps with building in more consistency. It also can make the whole flow faster. And as the tools are regulatory cleared, as mentioned, they're very accurate as well. So they can increase the statistical power of the clinical trial as well.
Awesome. So, I mean, just starting with the clinical trial, I'm imagining that, there's a pharmaceutical company that's studying a neurological disorder and they're starting to write up the protocol for the clinical trial. And I think they want to gather specific types of data in order to measure the impact of their therapeutic approach on that neurological disorder. And then they do some research and they reach out to you. Is that sort of like the way that things start, or, how does it begin? And then how does the relationship kind of grow from there?
Yeah, again, both are possible. So there are pharmaceutical companies that say, like, see, we have this mechanism of action of our drug. We think it might have effect on, for instance, remyelination, or it might have effect on a certain volume of a certain mass lesion in traumatic brain injury, or we think there might be an inflammation component that we want to better estimate. And then they ask us, like, okay, what is the ideal biomarker for that? And then sometimes we really refine the biomarkers, as it in natural history cohort studies, to see, like, okay, do we really measure something that is relevant for the mechanism of action? In other studies, like, for instance, if you look at typical studies in multiple sclerosis, they also have a kind of fixed endpoints, like, for instance, the new flare lesions or the brain atrophy patterns are quite typical endpoints in the phase 2 and phase 3 studies of multiple sclerosis. So these are then assessments, as mentioned, that we already brought towards clinical practice, and we actually use the same tools and in clinical trial. Major difference as where in clinical practice, our tool is just used, and then you still have the radiologist to make a final decision. In clinical trials, the supervision of the radiologist is even more strict, of course, so they can make small adaptations if necessary to really make sure that the endpoint is having the highest accuracy that is necessary for the trials, of course.
Yeah, interesting. So what your role as sort of a research partner to the pharmaceutical companies happens when there's a new type of biomarker that's being explored that's not already being measured in the field. But then, if the impact that they're trying to have is already measurable, given the tools that icometrix has available on provider sites, then it's just a matter of sort of partnering with you to make sure that all of the sites where the trial is occurring have your hardware and software, and then also that the data is getting transferred back to them in the correct format and and abiding by all of the regulations. Am I thinking about that right?
Yes, more or less. It's, of course, yeah, we're working most of the time software as a service. So all data is always sent to icometrix. We analyze them in-house, and as such, because our platform is very interoperable, on one hand, we have the connection with the clinical sites, where they can directly send data from the PACS to icometrix. On the other hand, it's very interoperable. So once we have done all the results, we can send, on one hand, results back towards the site, but also integrate, for instance, with data platforms of the pharmaceutical industry, such as the trial endpoints that we calculate can go directly into the databases for the trial itself and do the proper database analysis there. Also, as mentioned, we are indeed sometimes developing new biomarkers, but sometimes just acting as a imaging CRO, but then having the software actually as a backup to provide these services in a smoother way.
Yeah, interesting. So, obviously you've developed these amazing tools for the measurement and understanding and diagnosis of different neurological disorders, but you've also got to have this sort of back-end data infrastructure to make sure that patient data is transferred and abiding by all of the regulations that govern patient data. Can you give us any insight into, what that journey was like, sort of developing the data infrastructure to put that in place?
Yeah, it's definitely changed a lot over time. So we started actually with a public data infrastructure, but quite fast we created an own in-house data infrastructure. Core to our aspect is definitely the development of the ICO bridge, so which is the integration with the PACS system, so which allows us to bring data directly from the PACS to the icometrix cloud. Pseudomize is on the way, and then it's then in the iContainer, which is our own data infrastructure. There it's automatically analyzed, and then data, the results can be sent back to the same PACS using the encryption key again to put them again on the right place in the PACS again. So that's definitely one core part of our infrastructure. In the meantime, we have EMR integration as well, which we're doing via Smart on Fire. Which of course help further integration in the clinical workflow, definitely with a neurologist in that case. The iContainer, so the database infrastructure itself, it builds up on microservices. It's, as mentioned already, very interoperable. We follow there also the OMOP common data elements to capture data as much as possible in a standardized way. And of course, also the FAIR principles to have like data as findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. The full system is ISO 27001 certified for information security. So just to make sure indeed that all data is properly protected as well.
Do you have sort of a number of, how many providers you're supporting right now?
Yeah, it's always a difficult question as we are, I think we are connected with around 150 centers now. But what is difficult about that is, for instance, we connected with large imaging networks. For instance, we connected with RadNet and Shields in the US. And they again are then connected with a lot of private practices and so on, neurologist centers and so on. So actually the total number is a lot larger than this 150. But the 150 is really the full integrations that we have. And then on top of that, through pharmaceutical industry, we're also working along with a lot of sites, which is around 400 more or less. So it's on top of that, there's actually still a lot more as well. So it's a difficult number, but we are still a young company, of course, but already a quite nice integration in the clinical workflow, I would say.
Right. So, and do you have, sort of an idea of the order of magnitude of the number of patients whose data you've analyzed?
Good question. I think nowadays we analyze around 50,000 scans per year, but don't quote me on that because I can't be serious after. But I think it's around 50,000 a year, something like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, just what comes to mind for me with, the types of data that you're working with is just that, these are large data sets. The scale of data that you're working with for a single scan is really large. So I'm just interested in what are some of the challenges that you've faced in processing and analyzing huge quantities of these very large data sets and sort of, trying to scale out the infrastructure that you have.
Yeah. I think scaling out the infrastructure, it was quite all right. I mean, we're working cloud-based and we have a very good IT people that we work also with microservices, so we can deploy on new service very easily and things like that. So that's working all quite well. So in terms of scalability, in terms of numbers, that's not the biggest issue. I think the biggest issue is in data quality. Although there are guidelines nowadays in terms of what type of imaging you acquire and what quality it should be. So there are quite a lot of institute, foundations, consortia that provide guidelines like CMC, like Magnims, on doing a proper 3D T1 weighted scan, for instance. And we still see that in clinical practice, only 5% of the sites actually adheres to these guidelines, which is very low. I think it's increasing, but still very low. And that, of course, poses a lot more problems because, scanner switches are just like scans with insufficient quality. If you have very light slice thickness and you're trying to measure a very small lesion, it can just fall in between the slices and you cannot see it anymore. So actually a lot of information can be missed to these poor quality scans. And I think that's a bigger hurdle than the scalability of the analysis itself.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So how do you work with providers in that situation? Because I would imagine that the providers have an interest in providing you the quality of data that you need to give, the correct diagnosis.
Yeah, that's indeed true. So luckily, indeed, most of the providers that are working with us try to adapt. We have a special tool also developed, which is called icometrix. And icometrix actually allows us to benchmark the scans that we're receiving from the site at whom we're working to a database that we have in-house. And as such, we can basically say like, okay, your data is of sufficient quality, or actually, there's something wrong. Field of view is insufficient. There's a lot of movement artifacts that are typical. The contrast to noise is not sufficient, or things like that. And we can truly benchmark and actually improve. We can advise on optimal protocols. But even if it's an optimal protocol, by using icometrix, we can still see whether there might be factors that influencing it. A scanner, because it's a magnetic coil, there can be small things to influence the quality, and also problems can exist, like leakages in the coil, for instance, and that can in the end then result in very poor image quality. And using this icometrix tool, we at least know like where problems are coming from or what the key problem is, and then we can advise them on better protocols or help them with improving their acquisitions or pointing towards incorrect aspects of the scanner that where probably some updates are required as well.
so you have sort of automated tools that are sort of giving, baseline metrics for quality, but then there also needs to be kind of a human in the loop to like help assess, well, what exactly is going on with this image, or, why is the quality lower than it might be otherwise? Am I thinking about that right?
Yeah, so indeed, the first aspect that we have is our automated assessment, which is the quality metrics tool. It's, again, an AI-based methodology to assess quality. But then, of course, there's always human interaction. If you're looking, okay, quality is not good, what are we going to advise, or what might be the underlying cause? And that's often discussed with the center as well, of course.
Interesting. So as you encounter sort of the different neurological disorders that biotech companies are researching and the different biomarkers that they're searching for, I'm curious, how much of the work that you've done to develop the pipeline for analysis of MR and CT scans is sort of reusable for those problems, and how much do you find your organization sort of, exploring new pathways, building new infrastructure, trying to think differently about the problem space that you're in?
Good question. Broad answer again. I think the first part is indeed, if you're looking at different neurological disorders, I think there's definitely a generic framework. If we start with quantitative analysis of brain images, or generic framework is kind of the same. But of course, in terms of, then properly training and validating it, we still do that for every disease separately. And the reason for that is just because every disease has quite their own problems and presentation. And doing a proper validation for every and proper training for every disease. For instance, MS lesions look quite different from brain tumors, or can look quite different from traumatic brain injury, or even from the safety effects in Alzheimer disease now. So we really retrain our algorithms per disease. But the generic framework, I could say, it stays the same. Also in validation, we're looking towards, first of course, a technical validation, which is focused on accuracy, reproducibility, sensitivity in the first place. But then after we have performed this kind of more technical validation, we again also look towards clinical validation. What is actually, when we make these tools, can be a clinical impact of this kind of tool in the end. And then in the end, also an health economic and an outcome assessment, like, okay, what is the real impact of using this tool on patient outcome and on health economic benefits, so quality adjusted life years and cost efficacy, for instance. And that's something that we try to evaluate in each space separately, of course. The second aspect of the question is indeed, so I'm talking now most of the time about quantitative image analysis. But we try to also go beyond that. We have multiple projects starting where we try to combine multiple biomarkers, look, for instance, towards evoked potentials, OCT, blood biomarkers, and combine this with the imaging information as well as with the patient-reported outcomes, and put this in unified models, basically, to really see like how can we optimally address the true disease course.
At the baseline level, the interpretability of the models is just really important, because you're providing the core of what you're doing is not diagnosing the disease. It's providing insights to the providers so that they can better diagnose the disease. So that it strikes me that that's sort of a core component of why you have a model class per disease category, is because interpretability depends very much on sort of the logic underlying the way that we understand that disease. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct indeed. So that's indeed one of our core reasons why we act in different ways for different diseases.
The second thing I thought I heard was that, but over time, as we understand a disease better and we have this entire ecosystem of data surrounding it, there's also the opportunity to sort of combine all of the pieces of data together and have a less interpretable model that is sort of, coming up with a probability that this person has a particular neurological disorder. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And these technologies are, of course, still in development phase. We have multiple models ongoing, working on large databases to get indeed the right insights and so on. Second challenging aspect of that will, of course, be like, how do we bring this towards clinical practice? What will be regulatory aspects around these kind of devices, as well as they are more like decision tools rather than providing information. So that's, of course, still a big challenge. But I think at this point in time, providing us already tremendous amount of insights in looking at the disease course, like which patients are fast progressors, which patients are slow progressors, what's the underlying reason, What disease insights do we get from that? What is silent progression? Which progression, for instance, in MS is caused by relapses, which is caused by independent of relapses. And these insights, of course, of key importance also for developing new drugs and bringing new drugs to the market. So although all these models are not yet put into clinical practice, they're providing already a lot of insights at this point in time.
So, you're involved, it sounds like, on the commercial side with the biotech and pharma companies who are sort of trying to understand how diagnosis occurs inside of a provider setting, and sort of how they position their, therapeutic approaches in the right way, given the way that these diseases are diagnosed. And then also that you're sort of using like an understanding of the commercial landscape for these diseases to kind of prioritize where you're putting your attention from a modeling perspective. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely one of the key aspects that icometrix is doing. We are also a lot involved on the medical side as well, of course. As mentioned, we are involved in the drug development aspects. We are involved in post-market surveillance studies as well. But indeed, the commercial part of it and getting insight, but also, positioning a certain drug based on certain biomarkers, that's definitely indeed also a core part of our business.
Right. So it just sounds like you're spanning the entire scope of biotech activity, and that and as you mentioned, you're a relatively small company, and so there's only so many places that you can focus. So I'm just curious, how do you think about priority? And also, you're working with a toolkit that, this data science toolkit that, is really flexible as well. You can apply it to very different areas. So how do you determine where you're going to focus the energy of the organization in terms of, all of the different ways that you can impact the marketplace?
It's indeed true. Focus is important. And indeed, we're trying to cover indeed the full pharma landscape end to end. We also truly believe in that, because we believe like if you start developing a drug, you actually should already at that point in time think like which patients are we going to target and how are we going to reach this target population. So we truly believe in this end-to-end approach. But it indeed makes it sometimes difficult because pharma itself is often still quite fragmented. So you have to work with all these different divisions over time and also bring these solutions and this vision towards the full company. The advantage is twofold. First of all, we're coming from clinical practice. So they know us in this field and they know that we can bring things to clinical practice. So that's something that they've seen and they trust in us for. The second advantage is that second aspect is that we really try to focus on certain neurological conditions. So our first focus was definitely multiple sclerosis, as there were already disease-modifying treatments. Now with Alzheimer disease coming to the market and with treatments for Alzheimer disease coming to the market, there's definitely an opportunity there as well. And we see now MS a little bit as the blueprint for Alzheimer disease. So our focus is rather, although we do other neurological conditions as well, these are definitely two of our core focus areas where we try to work in the first place, because the story is the most clear to take this end-to-end approach.
Yeah. Do you have an example project that you've worked on that you're most proud of in terms of partnering with biotech companies to do either medical research or impact clinical practice, something like that?
There are still a lot ongoing where I cannot yet disclose the results, of course. There's one that is a little bit longer ago, but I think it tells a little bit the story of icometrix. And in the meantime, a lot has evolved, and I think we approach things in a more fundamental way. But as mentioned, it brings a little bit of story, and it was actually an MS drugs that was launched. And at the time, there was not so much known about brain atrophy. It's definitely not with the day-to-day physicians. Most of the treatment decisions were made and are still made, by the way, on lesion load. But the drug itself had like a quite big impact on brain atrophy. So they wanted actually to create awareness with the physicians that impacting brain atrophy is also important because it's a form of progression and it can, in the end, indicate disease worsening as well. And so we work together with a pharma company to actually bring our icobrain tools towards clinical routine and with towards a lot of physicians. And due to that, actually, we created awareness around this brain atrophy as they were capable of quantifying it. While on the other hand, the pharma company was better capable of doing a better product differentiation because now brain atrophy became a little bit more common knowledge. And while in the past it was mainly known by key medical experts, not really taken into account by the general neurologist, at least awareness was created. And not everything is clear about brain atrophy yet, or how to handle it. But I think, it had a quite big impact on product differentiation. And for us, it was also quite important because it helped us with bringing a product towards clinical routine.
Right. It just comes back to, if you can't measure it, then you can't really influence it, or you can't even understand your influence on it. So, having that measurement there in front of the provider at least, created the platform from which that influence could occur. Very interesting. So I know that we're running out of time. And so I just want, as we come to a close, I want you to look into the future of, how you see icometrix evolving, how you see, the use of machine learning in biotech in your arena evolving, and just, give us an insight into where you see things going over the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, there's of course a lot to do with AI algorithms and in general, also in terms of trial optimization or drug discovery. But in general thinking, and also in the vision of icometrix, what we really hope for is a true vision of precision medicine, of population health in a certain way. And in that sense, I think we are now at the point where oncology was almost 10 years ago, where oncology, they developed at that point in time the next generation in genomics, actually, having like a scalable, sensitive, data-driven detection platform that had then like the ultimate tumor genomic profile. And based on that, actually, it became very specific for certain cancers to say like, okay, this cancer you can treat with this kind of treatment, and because it did a certain risk prediction. And if you look at neurology today, and DMT usage, so the disease modifying treatments, the labels are very, very broad. You can treat everybody with every treatment that there is almost, for neurological conditions. While in fact, we don't know sufficient about like who has a favorable disease course, versus who has a poor prognosis, or who is more prone towards side effects of certain drugs. So we strongly believe actually in having better measurements available to actually also really move towards proper precision medicine. And in this context, we also believe in the collaboration between provider, payer, and pharmaceutical companies to really look at the landscape as one, and really say like, okay, treat the right patient at the right time, and due to that, reimburse those patients, reimburse the tools, and have really a closed system there. So that's our vision, and I think oncology was there 10 years ago, so I believe that neurology can be there in 5 years, hopefully.
Wonderful. Well, as we draw to a close, can you just let us know where people can find you or learn more about icometrix?
Yeah, sure. First of all, we have, of course, our website, www.icometrix.com. There's also, of course, our social media channels, particularly LinkedIn. But we also often present at conferences, mainly radiology and neurology conferences. So we'd be pleased to see people in person there. Some conferences by name are RSNA, ASNR, AN, ECTRIMS, AAIC, and ECR. So it would be a pleasure to meet people there in person.
Thank you. Well, Annemie, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for coming on, and look forward to connecting down the line.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure to be here.
And that's it for this episode of Data in Biotech. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe, rate, or leave a review in your podcast platform of choice. See you next time.